Is the so-called elective system, akademische akademische Freiheit, as the elective system, academic freedom, not as the freedom of professors to say whatever they will, and not as the freedom of universities to move apart from the supervision of governments, which would be two other ways to think about academic freedom. But the form in which it has, for the last 200 years, been of most moment, the elective system. So today, the notion of academic freedom is often put forward as some kind of vaguely right-wing talking point about some professors, or often they're not professors, they're just people that some right-leaning group, maybe the Federalist Society or so, on a campus as invited to speak, and then there's a controversy. This meaning, I would say, is not particularly interesting, and it gets a lot of attention in the news and on popular pundits and so forth. The fundamental issue, though, is the freedom of the student. So you have the three different forms of freedom of the professor, the freedom of the university, and the freedom of the student. The reason the freedom of the student is the most fundamental is because if those who are going to be, as we're constantly told, formed into the leaders of the world, so the leaders of the world are drawn from a few universities. The most gross example is the Supreme Court justices, who come only from not just 3 universities, but 3 very specialized training programs. Although I'll say in that case maybe it's mitigated to some extent, because if you're in Harvard Law School or Yale or Columbia, the 3 big ones, the 3 ones that are the only ones that are acceptable for the Supreme Court these days, I believe it's fairly streamlined. So of course it's true, there's electives are offered. Roberto Unger in the Harvard Law School, for instance. But the main form of the damage of the elective systems so far is, well, let's get this part clear. Why is the elective system potentially bad? It's because there's no unified or shared language, so to speak, which all the ruling class share, and then things run smoothly. So the contrast would be, say, in the 19th century, what the British so-called public schools were, which is to say the schools, I understand the phrase to mean schools which are meant to train people who are then going to go into public life. So Eden, for example, is the essential example. This we're talking about here, not college level, but even prior to college level, the boarding schools. These schools were meant to train in equal measure body, character, and intellect, and to sync all those 3 features up, and then to allow for the mutual um, sort of attrition of the contact of those students through the years in those grammar schools or those public schools, um, getting used to what it's like to uh, get along with one another and what the expectations are. So it's a certain kind of socialization that leads to a certain understanding of how one conducts oneself in conflict. So in the case of the British, Alan McFarland says there's a gamesmanship. Games play a huge role. Whereas in China, for instance, historically there was really no such thing as games for most of the history of the Middle Kingdom. Whatever exception, I mean, there's a guy called Needham, Joseph Needham, the big China, supposedly the greatest English expert on China there ever was. One can consult him about this kind of issue, but basically, even though you can presumably name a few exceptions to that, nonetheless, you could say maybe if you look really closely, what you're calling games aren't really games in the sense that we mostly mean it in with Western adolescence or with sports. But that being as it may, you can see the essence of what I'm getting at is the syncing up of everyone, and also within oneself of the body, character, and intellect to one aim. So if, as we have in the West, especially since beyond the year 1900, which is the year Nietzschean thinking took over, at least in the German-speaking universities, but it was already the notion of a fact as in contrast to a value, whereas fact used to mean something like deed or action, and it was contrasted with words. But the notion that we know fact, something testable, some kind of object doing something that's testable, as opposed to some kind of, to put it in a higher, I suppose a better language for rhetoric today would be vision. So people are supposed to have visions, and even a visionary sounds, I suppose visionary sounds a little bit like when they used to keep repeating the word maverick with regard to that Sarah Palin. But in any case, that everyone is supposed to have their own vision and or their own values, or to at least subscribe to some values or decide on their values, especially during the college years. Somebody decides to join a certain group, it shows that their affiliation, then they become more and more like that, and they more and more draw their identity from that, their pride from that, and so on and so forth. And people that aren't part of that group become more and more weird to them, and so on. From this point of view, the elective system and the allowing people to have a choice in this, on political lines, but also simply in the normal meaning of elective system, and just what course people take. That people take all kinds of different courses, and and then they graduate with supposedly the same education, but it's a totally different education, and not just because of the profession they've chosen, but also in many other ways, so that the standard core unified understanding of a whole class of people is divided. So this is a question which runs close in tandem with several other questions. So one could say, in one sense, it's a concrete and feasible measure to a university could immediately dispense with the elective system, with this academic freedom of students to choose their courses. But in another sense, are there the questions of what the deeper problems are. The advantage of it is, I think, we could see in Nietzschean terms, in a certain sense, that um, uh, in former times, say under Bismarck, it was possible, and if you bring in uh, some form of Christianity or some form of religion, you can see how plans which would be made stretching out for millennia people could be set themselves towards those plans confidently, because they have a teaching which is a cosmic teaching, which seems to cover them. And it strikes to me that if you didn't have the elective system, so for instance, it shows, because we have some breaks. So for instance, in philosophy, the break, which is banally called the break between analytic and the continental tradition. You see, when you see people trained only in one or the other tradition, so-called, then they're perfectly happy not to think about, to go along with the, what their tradition says, and to, as it were, despise the other tradition as merely talking nonsense, or as somehow defective and naive, and etc., etc. The other group can simply be dismissed because you have your core group. So the whole of the university had only one core group. You could see the advantages. You have a lot more less, or let's put it this way, there's less ethical confusion. There's less ethical intricacy, which then in a certain way is a remedy to this so-called Durkheim's enemy, or the sense of the isolation or loneliness. So far as these questions are only a question of a rivalry between several big blocks, and don't raise to the level of the consciousness of somebody like Leo Strauss or Heidegger, or somebody who's really grappling with the problems in the extreme form of a Nietzsche. Then you have sort of both good and bad, because you get to ridicule the opponent, and you enjoy how stupid they are, and etc., etc. And there's something good about it. And then sometimes you have to weep because the opponent does something which everyone has to recognize as sensible, and then you realize you made a mistake or something like that. Maybe, depending on how multifaceted your character is, I suppose, how open you are to this possibility that the other intellectual culture has something to say for it. So the question is, the example I wanted to give is in analytic philosophy. For example, they admit sort of things like Hume's. They call it the Hume gulf between the is and the ought, which isn't really what's active, because what's really active is something that's not a matter of a problem at the level of a few specialists, but it's everybody in common sense. The notion of facts and values has taken over, so that it's everywhere. So this example gives a kind of a sense of what real philosophy would be, which is looking at the things which have become norms for reason for everyone, and then grappling with that. So the which I would call the fact-value distinction, which came from Simmel through Nietzsche, or you have this kind of philosophy as dealing with sort of cabined problems, fake problems in a certain way, or problems which could become which have some sort of um, adjacent reality or something, but not talking about the direct reality. So the question would be, if we would dispense with elective systems, then it's a great problem whether we would choose the correct system, because it would be perhaps so difficult to steer it to the right direction um, if it were the wrong system. In any case, I think this reflection over unanimity or uh, confused semi-anarchy, or however you wanted to make this distinction between the how's it word, self-selected from the ready-made courses in the university, then educations rather than education, or something which deliberately aims at the sustaining power and the gain which comes from unanimity. Many criticisms could fall on even the attempt to try to characterize the question that way, but I think it's at least worth considering, simply because it's such a tangible and real option for people. I don't see how there's a real barrier to the experiment of doing it. The criticism would then be something like, isn't this what constitutes totalitarianism? Isn't this this forced education all to one way? But then it strikes to me there's something ghastly naive about that, because it's really that we're just saying the fact that you let some people that are very young make some decisions on their own out of a kind of box of things already there, is that really less? The lack of totalitarianism is only that instead of having a system which makes everyone who is going to be most important, as in the British Empire, think the same way, or in Nazi Germany, or in the Soviet Union, or in America prior to, say, World War I or so. Not sure exactly when the elective system became really strong in America, but this just conceals the issue, because then you still have this, you just have a wishy-washy form of education slash brainwashing, or education slash how do they call it, our formation of the person. It's just a different form of totalitarianism. All countries, so far as they have prolonged 20 years of education, are totalitarian, are totally forming the so-called individual. There's it's usually an unclarity about what is meant by a supposed distinction between individualism and collectivism, whereas most of the time what's meant by individualism is simply economic, so that the main issue is how so far does the government allow contract to come to full sway, so that the cake case, the 1905 New York Baker case, for instance, which is still in dispute between Richard Epstein, and Richard Epstein says and tells his students, some of which will no doubt become important in the future, that um, uh, Justice Roberts, lead Supreme Court Justice Roberts, has got that wrong, and things like this, and that contract and corporation be understood as the same, so that corporation, rather than being something like the medieval guilds, which the king allowed to be semi-autonomous because they were producing all the things, beds, candles, clothing, everything that the country needed, they were allowed to be semi-autonomous. But if instead corporation means that it's just like a private contract, so that any individual can, if they get enough money, do whatever they want, you can see that the very people that are libertarian are then, and supposedly are for this, are then forced to constantly pretend that what they're against is monopoly. But actually what they're against is they don't like it when people that have different views than them have an extravagant amount of influence, which of course they will if they're successful in some business such that they become a global corporation. So these issues, I just mentioned that because of the notion that there's supposedly, because of the confusion over whether the elective system is actually producing more individual choice, which it is in some sense, but whether that's actually what's usually meant by individualism. So you could have no elective system, have forced, think of the British Empire, but at the same time have so-called individualism, if that means that contract and private property are not touched by the education which would be forced on everyone. So actually, if you wanted that, it would be better to have everyone educated, to think that's the only sensible way. So these are problems which are very profound, in the sense that at every point you're faced with unpleasant selections. Because if you say it needs to be a matter of the somehow a choice, but who's making the choice? The professors in advance who have the courses that are the choices for the elective system, or why shouldn't, if one side is better, why shouldn't that just be enforced on everyone from the beginning, and they never really think, it would never really trouble you because you'd have it your whole life. But how could we actually know that it's better unless, etc., 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 all kinds of problems come in, which I haven't thought through enough to give too much guidance on, but I just raised the issue. As a coda, I'll say I wanted to mention before, since we were talking about economic systems, that it strikes me that all the important economists that we talk about in recent, as far as political debates go, have these, not just some concept about an economic mechanism, but they're all putting forward some kind of social plan along with it, so that von Mises, for instance, says that he supports the democracy in the sense that the vote will decide. But then he says, it's not that I want this kind of leveling by the lowest common denominator. So people that don't know the issues will vote, and then they'll vote some stupid way. It's actually that what he really wants is the voting as a mechanism of producing aristocracy. So he thinks that the vote, if it runs right, that people will vote for the aristos rather than the krakos, the best rather than the worst, and that then therefore election is a form of aristocracy in the rational sense, in the sense of the president. So then Joseph Biden, as the president, since he was elected, should be the aristos, or the best of the Americans. So the idea is favoring the vote because it can select the best people. But if the vote's not actually selecting the best people, he says, well, maybe it won't work out that way. So in Chapter 8 of Human Action, he actually says that. He says, well, maybe it won't work out that way, but at least it's better than the alternatives. So, but he's writing the book like right in the wake of World War II, where he's terrified and he's just trying to avoid war. So it's like, is that actually a good strategy? If you just to sort of utopianly think maybe democracy is good because it's going to select the best people, but if it doesn't, well, at least it's not producing. At least war is the ultimate evil, and we have to avoid it at all costs. And so, but he doesn't really. The people that are selecting von Mises are acting as though there was this great gulf between Hayek and Keynes, or this great contest. I think are not really looking either at what the economic theories are involved, or at why they're even on one side or the other. It's just thrown in with the party political forced affiliations, which are part of these identities which have been built up through the elective system, and all kinds of unfortunate things follow from that. Okay, so let's leave it at that.